Thank you so much, Mara, and good morning to everyone. I hope everyone is doing well today. I put in the chat the link to today's document, and everyone should know that after the class, Mara sent out the link. So if you just hang tight for a few hours, usually the link with, or not the link, but a PDF version of the document will go out. So you will get a copy. The Google Doc is not accessible after the class. It's only accessible during the class. So, so welcome to this week's Torah portion study. One more piece that I'll share with everyone, two more, is that I do generally stop periodically in between sections, or just periodically for questions and reflections. And so if you have one, make a note, and then as soon as we stop, I hope to hear from you. If you do not, it's always a big group, and if you don't get to ask your question or share a reflection, you are welcome to email me. My email, which you can write down, is Abby, ABBY, @explorejewish.com. And you're welcome to email me, and I will try and get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks, Mara. And in general, the chat does pop up on my screen. I see it at the bottom, but I am not focused on it. And if there is something that you want to share, I will likely not see it, especially if there are a lot of notes, a lot of chats. So definitely, hopefully ask your question during the class or share your reflection aloud, or you can email me. So I think without further ado, I will go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. Oh, Mara, can you enable me to share the screen?
Yes, you should be good now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, great. So today I actually want to share some Torah thoughts from both this week's and last week's Torah portion. I want to pull together some ideas that are in both parshiot, both Torah portions, and have us keep in mind really everything that we've read so far in Deuteronomy. I also want to put out there, I want us to keep in mind that we are in the middle, after the fast day of Tisha B'Av that marks the destruction of the temple. After that fast day, which was a couple weeks ago, we are in the midst of what is called the 7 Haftarot of consolation that takes us through the high holidays. So I want us to be mindful, and hopefully I may come back to this, that we're in a time period where the texts that we're reading are supposed to comfort us and give us a sense of support and, let's say, nurturing from a higher power, from God, a spiritual sense of nurturing. And I want us to keep that in mind as we go through the texts. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to share this part of my screen, which you do not have. If you really want it, I can share it with you. It is my working document with a very detailed outline of the book of Deuteronomy with some notes. And I want to walk us through a couple of main themes and sections of Deuteronomy to lay the groundwork for the texts that we'll study in depth today. So I do hear some background noise. I don't know why that is. So I don't know if that's on my end or if there's anybody that's not muted. So thank you. Just to make sure everyone can hear clearly. I'm going to make this bigger than it is, quite big here, and share with you something you may already know, that Moses is the speaker in the book of Deuteronomy, and he has multiple speeches. They can be divided into 3 or 4. And our Torah portion in Ekev, this is this week's Torah portion, is part of his second speech, but he's already spoken. And I want us to get a handle on what he's spoken about. So there are a few different layers. Moses reviews the story of the Israelites. Some things are a little bit different than in the books of Exodus and Numbers primarily, the second and fourth book, but he reviews the story of the Israelites. And also in between the story, and this is part of what makes Deuteronomy a little bit difficult to follow, is that there are smatterings of laws, like there's a mention of the cities of refuge. There's a lot of emphasis on obeying only one God. And there's a review of the 10 Commandments. And in this week's and last week's Torah portion, and this is where I'm going to switch to our document that you do have. In this week's and last week's Torah portion, we find the first paragraph of the Shema, the first paragraph of the daily prayer that we refer to as the Shema, recited traditionally 3 times a day. And in this week's Torah portion, we have the second paragraph of the Shema, different sections in Deuteronomy, chapter 6, which I'll add in English, and chapter 6 and chapter 11. So I want us to read together those paragraphs to ground us more deeply in the content of the last couple of Torah portions to really get a sense of what's going on in Deuteronomy. And then I want to pull out from last and this week's Torah portion a couple of verses that stand out as different from the main themes of Deuteronomy last week, this week, even the week before. So before we do that, I'd like to invite someone to read the English, which I think is the JPS translation from here, our document, verses 4 through 9. Would someone read these verses for us? And you can raise your hands and then we can unmute you, I believe. Okay, great. So Ginny, I think Mara can unmute you. I don't know if I can do that. Oh,
Yes.
Ginny's
Yes,
unmuted.
Jenny's now
Oh, great. Okay,
Okay.
great.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Take to heart these instructions with which I charge you this day. Impress them upon your children. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates.
Okay, great. So a paragraph that may or may not be familiar to you, there's this commandment to love God. And in the Torah, love doesn't mean and doesn't conjure up what we think of as love. So when we often have the question of, well, how can a feeling be commanded? A feeling is not actually being commanded here. What is being commanded is loyalty. Love in the Torah refers to loyalty, and it's very much a set of loyal actions. So you're supposed to take to heart these instructions, take them very seriously, and it refers to what comes before. Impress them upon your children, recite them every day, and then there are actions that we are supposed to take as a reminder, like the tefillin or phylacteries that some Jews traditionally wear on their heads and on their arms daily, and also mezuzot, what Jews traditionally put on their doorposts with the Shema inside. So there are actions and loyalty, and these ideas really bring together for us everything in Deuteronomy. There's a very strong sense of loyalty that's being encouraged and actions that we are supposed to take to express that loyalty. So let's keep going to ground ourselves in the big ideas here. And I'm going to ask someone, thank you, Ginny, by the way, I'm going to ask someone to read verses 13 through 21. They'll go by, it seems like a lot, but they'll go by quickly. So can we get another voice? Jay. Oh, David, sorry. Jay, I thought I saw Jay on here from yesterday. I do see him. I thought it was him. So David, go ahead and read verses 13 through 21.
Okay. If then you obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, loving the Lord your God and serving him with all your heart and soul, I will grant the rain for your land in season, the early rain and the late. You shall gather in your new grain and wine and oil. I will also provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and thus you shall eat your fill. Take care not to be lured away to serve other gods and bow to them, for the Lord's anger will flare up against you, and he will shut up the skies so that there will be no rain. Oh, wait a minute.
Sorry, I got.
There will be no rain, and the ground will not yield its produce, and you will soon perish from the good land that the Lord is assigning to you. Therefore, place these my words upon your very heart, tie them as a sign on your hand, and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead, and teach them to your children, reciting them when you stay at home, and when you are away, when you lie down, and when you get up, and inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, to the end that you and your children may endure that the Lord swore to your fathers to assign to them in the land as long as there is a heaven over the earth.
Okay, David, thank you very much. David and Jenny, thank you for getting us started with reading text today. These verses here clearly are about reward and punishment. If you do what God tells you, you will be rewarded with a productive harvest season. If you don't do what God tells you, you will be punished and ultimately exiled from the land. And these ideas, what I shared earlier, the first paragraph of the Shema, not only are they in the Jewish daily liturgy because they are key ideas from the Hebrew Bible and became key ideas in our Jewish tradition, they are pivotal in centering us on the ideas in Deuteronomy: loyalty, love, action, symbols for obeying God, and reward and punishment. So from a modern perspective, some of us, not all of us, might have trouble with the reward and punishment theology, meaning it might be difficult for us to acknowledge that, okay, if I do something, I will be rewarded from heaven. If I don't do something correctly, I will be punished. And that can get into very tricky theology, especially post-Holocaust. It's troubling. For some people, I'm sure there are people on this call that would say that's not troubling to me at all. I accept that theology, and my life is built with that in mind. It doesn't bother me. So I'm speaking to those in particular right now for whom that's troubling. I want to share a little bit of a different perspective on reward and punishment, and then bring us into some alternative verses that really stand out in different ways from these key ideas here. So I want to share that I think the ancients, our ancestors, certainly struggled with suffering and evil. And most of us, I think I shared yesterday on the call, I had a big birthday recently. You can't get to the age that I am. I look younger than I am, but you can't get through life without pain and suffering and loss. It just doesn't happen. I think our ancestors, ancient peoples, whether they were Israelites or others, they noticed that. And for them, they understood suffering or loss as coming from God. For us, I think we can just say, sometimes in life, we experience loss and pain and suffering, and sometimes we don't. And I hope for most of us, for much of the time, there's reprieve from loss or suffering, and there's joy and connectedness and calm presence. And so what I want to bring us to today are verses that in Deuteronomy really stand out, at least in this first section of Deuteronomy, as verses that get us to a place of reprieve. And I mentioned earlier the haftarot of consolation. Last week, the haftarah began with the words, Nachamu, Nachamu, may you be comforted, you will be comforted. And I want us to look at some verses today and try and glean the nuances of these verses in the context of reprieve and comfort and solace and calm presence. So I'm going to go ahead and read text number 3 here, which is Everett Fox's translation. And then I want us together to look at a Rashi, the 11th, mostly 11th century commentator, to see what Rashi says about the nature of one word in particular in text number 3, and see what we can glean about solace and comfort. So in the middle of verses that are not, which we're not going to look at now, but you'll have a link in there. In the middle of verses that are more harsh in tone, we have these verses. But when you seek God, your God, from there, you will find God. If you search for God with all your heart and with all your being. When you are in distress, because there befall you all these things in future days, you shall return to God, your God, and listen to his voice. For a compassionate God is your God. He will not weaken you. God will not bring ruin on you. God will not forget the covenant with your fathers, which he swore to them. You noticed I tried to change the gender up a bit. And as I shared yesterday on the class on God, I do often keep in Everett Fox's translation, which keeps the tetragrammaton, the 4 letters that traditionally are not said. In the class on God, and often in an academic or in a learning setting, I do say those words, but when I can easily avoid it and it's right in front of you, I do try and abide by that. So here is a text of comfort, and I put here in the middle column just some notes on if we think about these things that God will do for us from a more positive place, meaning rather than in the negative, in the positive, we see compassion, strengthening, enlivening, remembering and upholding a commitment or a promise. So with all that in mind, I actually want us to look at a Rashi who comments on this one word, yarpecha, which is a little bit of a tricky word. Everett Fox beautifully translates as weaken, but you'll see, we'll take a look at other places where the word is used, and you'll see that Everett Fox's translation comes from an understanding of other places where a similar word is used in the Hebrew Bible. And I think this will expand our notion of what God's comfort and nurturing and strengthening can mean. So here is Rashi, which I'm going to read. There are a few grammatical notes in it that aren't terribly relevant. I mean, they're important, but what's mostly relevant is the meanings of the words and the stories behind the words, which I will share with you after or as I read the text. So many of you know Rashi was an early medieval commentator, groundbreaking commentator, set the stage for many medieval commentaries to come. And often Rashi shares with us a midrash, a narrative interpretation, or he might share different, like here, different places in the Hebrew Bible where the word or a similar word in our verse might be used. So the word again is yarpecha, which Everett Fox translates as weaken. So Rashi says this means God will not stop holding you, or God will not stop holding Israel. God will not stop holding Israel's hands. The expression lo yarpecha is causative, meaning God will not cause you to weaken. God will not cause separation of you from him. In Hebrew, hiphil is a causative tense. It usually means I'm causing something to happen. This word is also used in the sentence in Song of Songs. I held him and I did not let go. A beautiful sentence that paints an image, and all of Song of Songs paints beautiful images of a man and a woman in love, and both of them at different times not letting go of each other. But here in Song of Songs chapter 3, actually a particularly beautiful chapter, I think, the woman says, I held the man and I did not let go. And a similar word is used. In Hebrew, even if you are not a Hebrew reader, you can see that yarpecha and arpenu look similar. There's the resh and the pei. It's not yet clear what the third, Hebrew has 3-letter generally roots. So it could be a hey, it could be a yud. It's not clear yet, but nevertheless, the words are similar and there's a sense of holding on tightly. We're going to keep going. Each time the word rifyon is used, it refers to a causative verb or a reflexive verb. For example, leave her alone. I'll explain that in a moment. And in Hebrew here, tain la rifyon from 2 Kings. And again, give me a moment and I'll explain. And also from Deuteronomy, from our Torah portion, heref mimeni, let me be. So in addition to the verse, and I know this is confusing, so I'm going to say it again. In addition to the idea from Song of Songs that our root that we're dealing with in this word yarpecha, or possibly weaken, in addition to it meaning let go, it also means leave alone. What's the context here? In 2 Kings, one of the prophets, and actually I meant to look up, I think it's Elisha rather than Elijah. Elijah and Elisha are the prophets that appear for us at the end of 1 Kings and the beginning of 2 Kings. And they're both they take these roles as kind of miracle workers. And there's a case where, and again, you can look it up or I can look it up and you can email me. I meant to do it, I forgot. Elisha, I believe, Elijah's protege, heals or he encounters a woman whose son has died. And the sentence here, leave her alone, is about leaving that mother alone to grieve. Very disturbing sentence. And another disturbing sentence in the book of Deuteronomy is where God and Moses are reviewing what happened in the book of Exodus with the golden calf story. And God says, leave me alone. I'm going to destroy the people. And Moses says, no, no, no. What will people think? Don't destroy them. And God forgives them. But all these contexts are about letting go, letting someone experience loss or pain or suffering on their own, and also letting someone suffer. God wanted to be alone in God's grief about the Israelites and their misbehavior. In our verse, God says, keeping in mind all these verses, I'm not going to do that. There's no leaving alone. There's no leaving alone someone in their pain, in their suffering, in their grief, and their loss. Lo yarpecha. God will not weaken you. God will not let go. And that's why Rashi says, as his first sentence, God will hold Israel by the hand. That's Rashi's image of God not letting Israel go. So again, I want us to come back to the context of what we're taking a look at here in this week's and last week's Torah portion. Most of the verses are about commandments, reward, punishment, mostly punishment. And yet, in the midst of our verses, the larger group of verses at the beginning of Deuteronomy, we get these verses about God's compassion for us. And one of the most beautiful images I think that we could possibly get of holding our hands, and often holding a hands can mean guidance or just comfort, but there's this very deep and strong sense of togetherness and closeness. So also coming back to the framing that I shared earlier in the context of the 7 weeks of consolation of Haftarot, ironically, while we read the 7 Haftarot of consolation, we're also reading difficult and harsh verses in Deuteronomy. Yet what screams out to us, I think, in these beautiful images is of God not letting us go, and of spiritual nourishment, sustenance, and strengthening from a higher power. And I mentioned earlier that I suggested that when we think about sin and punishment in the Hebrew Bible, perhaps it can be comforting to us as modern readers to think about our ancestors struggling with the suffering and loss they experienced. And perhaps our framing can be a little bit different, and we can think about the Torah as observing, ancient people observing that, of course, people experience pain, suffering, and loss, but they also can experience reprieve. And beyond reprieve, they can experience a sense of nurturing and strengthening from a spiritual perspective or even interpersonally. Whenever we read texts about God's role in human life, I think we can use the framing of B'Tselem Elokim, that humans are created in God's image, as mentioned at the beginning of Genesis, and think about each other as comforts and holders of each other's hands in times of loss and suffering. So we have these two, primarily it is true that in Deuteronomy, most of the texts are harsh. And on the other hand, as we make our way through the book, we also have the sense of comfort and nurturing and sustenance spiritually and perhaps even interpersonally. We have two different poles or arms that speak to us through the book of Deuteronomy and in the context of the 7 haftarot of consolation. So that those haftarot even allow us to think more so about the verses of comfort in the Torah itself than we might otherwise if we weren't in this time period of comfort. So I want to pause here. I said a lot. I want to pause here and see if there are questions. First, any clarification questions? We'll take those first, and then I'll ask if there are any questions more abstractly or reflection. So is there any clarification that's needed on what I've shared with you so far?
I think Mitt in the chat has both a clarifying question and also it can become a bigger question.
Okay.
But he's saying, is God saying this to us as individuals or to us as the Jewish body, as the Jewish people?
Okay, great. Fair question. I think in general, the text is certainly, it is directed toward the Israelite people, but I would make the suggestion, and if that doesn't work for you, that's fine. I think you can certainly make not too far of an interpretive leap and take these verses to heart on an individual level. Other clarification questions? Okay, so let's hear, are there any questions or reflections at the moment based on what's been said so far? I hope there are. I'm eager to hear. None at all? That's not good.
And people are sitting with a lot of what you had said, and lots of reflections on punishment and etc. Jay just asked, what verse in Deuteronomy is Lo Yarpecha in?
So that it's actually a good question. I believe I labeled the verses correctly here, but I discovered I might have been one verse off. So, I'm actually going to check when we're right now. I want to correctly label them. I think I may have been off by one verse. It used to be when I copied and pasted text from Sefaria, that's the website that I mostly use for copying and pasting text. It used to be that you could, the verse numbers would copy no problem. And now they don't do that anymore. And so I have to add them in manually. And so I think I may have been off, but I'm going to double check. No, I'm correct. Yeah. So it is verse 31 in chapter 4. And that is from last week's Torah portion. I'm going to show everyone a verse from this week's Torah portion too. So let me go ahead and do that, and then let's see if there are other questions or reflections. So I want to show everyone that, again, we can see here verse 3 from chapter 8, this week's Torah portion. And again, I'll invite you to go back to the context of these verses. Mark, I see your question, so hang tight for a moment. in this verse, which I'll also read, and then I'll invite someone to read a modern commentary, again, we can see that there's this very strong sense of God's nurturing. So at the beginning of verse 3, God reviews, and this is a new piece of information that we didn't have before in the Torah, that God gave the Israelites the man, but also the man was a particular kind of lesson that we hadn't seen before in the actual the manna stories in Exodus and Numbers. So I'll read this verse here, these two sections, and then I'll invite someone to read a modern commentary on it. So Everett Fox translates the following way. So God afflicted you and made you hungry and had you eat the man, which you had not known and which your fathers had not known, in order to make you know that by bread alone, not by bread alone, do humans stay alive, but rather by all that issues from God's mouth do humans stay alive. And the Hebrew is very beautiful here, so I also want to read that for our Hebrew readers. Lema'an hodiacha, in order so that you know, ki lo al halechem levado yichya ha'adam. A person doesn't live on bread alone. Ki al kol motza fi Adonai yichya ha'adam. A person lives based on everything that comes out of the mouth of God. So not only law, let's say, which does come out from the mouth of God, but we could extend that and say, as follow-up to the previous verses, God is a nurturing God for us and allows us to sustain ourselves. We are spiritually sustained based on our relationship with a higher power. And I want us to, I'm going to skip the Ibn Ezra, which you can do on your own, but Rabbi Shai Held, who writes incredibly beautifully, and I think really speaks to a modern sensibility, discusses many interpretations of not living on bread alone. And I want us together to read what is his last of several interpretations, which I think is very powerful for us. So can I ask for a reader for Rabbi Shai Held's perspective to round out our study today? Okay, great. Oh, David, thank you. I see that. I know you read. I just want to give somebody the opportunity if they haven't already. Okay, great. Jay, will you go ahead and read Rabbi Shai's writing here? And then David, I know you have a question. Or Mark, I know you have a question. So Jay, I think Mary can unmute you or you can unmute.
One can
Great.
imagine a situation in which a lengthy sojourn in the wilderness is intended to teach independence and self-sufficiency. But for Deuteronomy, the point of Israel's prolonged wandering is just the opposite. The people need to learn that they are always and everywhere dependent on God. Chapter 8 urges the simple acknowledgement that all the gifts that make for life come from the hand or the mouth of God. What the wilderness ultimately tests is Israel's willingness to embrace dependence. Real piety requires us to surrender the illusion of self-sufficiency. As human beings, we are fragile and vulnerable, and therefore irreducibly dependent both on God and on other people. As Israel prepares to enter the land, Moses looks back and tells them what he hopes they have learned in their wanderings, that they need God and live by God's word.
Okay, thank you so much, Jay, for reading that so beautifully. So Rabbi Shai adds to the sense of nurturing that we've already been talking about and adds the sense of dependence. And I mentioned earlier that I was extending the sense of spiritual nurturing also to nurturing between human beings. And I think Rabbi Shai does that so beautifully also. In some ways, I find Rabbi Shai's reading a little bit extreme. And you can see at the very top of the document, I'll scroll back down to Rabbi Shai in a moment, I mentioned interdependence, which I think really speaks to kind of a healthy dependence on other people or on a higher power. And I want us to think about that I don't think Rabbi Shai is saying, and I certainly wouldn't say we should only be dependent on God or only be dependent. Certainly being an independent, self-sufficient person is quite important and helps us make our way through the world. And not just helps us, but that's how many of us function, being self-sufficient. But there is this sense of healthy dependence and receiving, being open to nurturing from a spiritual and interpersonal perspective that I think our Torah portions the past couple weeks, especially in the context of the Haftarot, are asking us to think about. So let me pause here. I know Mark has been patiently waiting, so I'm eager to hear your questions or reflections in Mark, and then we'll take one or two others before we conclude. So Mark, you can unmute, or Eric can unmute you.
Okay. So there's one problem that comes up in the wanderings and the journeys, and that is if there's a drought and there is no rain, and the people are losing faith in God because he's supposed to provide the rain, and because of the climate conditions you can't have it, and therefore they go to other gods and they worship other gods, hoping they'll get rain. How do we reconcile that propensity of people? Well, if you're not giving me what you promised, then I'll go somewhere else and hope I'll get it there. And it's almost losing faith, because it's not God's fault. I don't know. I mean, climate is climate, if God's in charge of that. But how would you reconcile that in terms of our teachings?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I guess I would say, and I don't know if this will be satisfying to you, but I guess I would say that throughout the Torah, the Israelites do have breaks of faith, and they do lose patience, and they do get scared very easily. They get scared about the leadership. They get scared about not having enough water and food. They get scared about being able to conquer the land. And I think from the perspective of them as former slaves, we can understand their fear. The classical view, the rabbinic view, tends to be that they didn't have enough faith, and we should learn from that. I somehow wonder if we can combine both perspectives, that even though throughout the books of the Torah, the Israelites do struggle with a sense of spiritual dependence, it's very difficult for them to do that. I think for us, maybe in today's world, when we have some of our basic needs met, many of us do, not all of us, I think maybe it's easier to also open ourselves up to a layer of spiritual nurturing. It wasn't easy for the Israelites. And the only thing that I guess where I'm landing is I just want us to be compassionate toward them. They were not able to always have faith, but for us reading these verses years later, maybe it is easier for us to balance self-sufficiency and to build self-sufficiency, as well as a sense of openness to spiritual and interpersonal interdependence and nurturing. So Mark, thank you for your question. Marcia has a question. Yeah, sure. Marcia, go ahead. You can.
So if we are not ready to seriously comprehend our interdependence, how can we either participate in the giving of chesed or in the receiving of chesed from other humans?
That's a great. Oh, what was the last thing you were going to say?
Oh, and on our part towards other humans.
Okay.
Although obviously that extends to, sentient beings and animals, et cetera. But, we can start with our interdependence between humans.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that if we're not, I guess I'll speak for myself in my own journey, and whoops, okay, there we go. I think the more that we are aware of our interdependence, the more we are able to act with chesed, with love and kindness toward ourselves and others. I think it's harder when we're not, let's say, as evolved or as, in our own growth. The more that we grow into ourselves and in our relationships with other people, I think it is easier to act with love and kindness, chesed, as you said, and compassion with ourselves and others. But it is a journey. I think it does take time. And the way you framed your question is, how can we? I don't think we can as well. I don't think, if we are struggling with a sense of balancing and our own both independence and interdependence, it does make it harder to be kind and compassionate toward ourselves and others. So I hope for all of us, I think that's it's a great lead in to say that for all of us, I hope that as we grow in our own lives and within ourselves, we are able to embrace nurturing of ourselves and others in deeper ways. So Marcia, thank you. We'll take one more. I see Edward's raised hand. So Edward, if you could ask your question, that would be great. And keep your raised hand up so it makes it easier for me to see you while you're asking your question.
Okay, hopefully I can be heard.
Okay, yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Just based on what I've been hearing so far, and it's just an observation of mine, I think we're looking at the fact that because there are droughts and no rain and so forth, that we need to turn to some other entity or some other direction in order to find that, to see if someone will give us that help. But at the same time, what we are failing to realize is that the Father does not ask us to bear more than we can. The fact that we're able to have droughts in our lives or in a season of our life and no rain in our lives and everything, rain can be good, rain can be bad. You can have an overflow of rain or you can have an underflow of rain. Does that mean that you're supposed to turn around and look to some other entity that is made by man in order to overcome the conditions you are brought on by your own actions or brought on by some calamity within a country or something like that that goes against the teachings of the Father? No, it means that you're supposed to become stronger in your relationship with Him when you're praying to Him in order for Him to reach you and to provide that sunshine that you are looking for, or that way out that you are looking for, the end of the tunnel, the light at the end of the tunnel, however you prefer to use it. But
Okay. Edward, you just have to wrap up because we're going over a bit, and I just want to respect everyone's time.
It just gives you the opportunity to be stronger in your relationship with Him.
Yeah, I like your use of the word strength. Thank you so much. I guess the last thing that I'll say here, and I want to respect everyone's time, we're going a minute over, is that I think Deuteronomy opens the conversation for us about suffering, loss, reprieve, and strength. And for all of us, that's going to be a little different. And what we're able to do and how we're able to overcome different losses and traumas and difficulties in our lives, it's different for all of us. And I would ask us to think about, at the end of our time together today, the questions that Deuteronomy raises. What do we do with loss and suffering in our own lives? Do we open ourselves up to spiritual nourishment, to nourishment from mental health professionals when we need that, from friends, family, loved ones, from our wellspring of inner strength? So I want to suggest to us that Deuteronomy is asking us to think about all those questions as it walks us through the difficulties that the Israelites experienced, and hopefully inviting us to think about challenges, but also reprieves in our own lives. So I invite everybody to continue to think about those things in the coming weeks ahead. in the 7 Haftarot weeks of consolation. We're at 6 at this point. And wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom with nurturing and strength and reprieve and rest. And I hope to see you all again very soon.
Thank you so much, Abby. Thank you all for being here. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.